The same day, the Catholic Archbishop for the U.S. Armed Services says it would be morally acceptable for U.S. service members to refuse orders from this president to invade a country that he is currently threatening.
This is not a warning. This is the moment after the warning has already failed. The language has changed. The tone has hardened. America's most powerful religious institutions are no longer offering guidance or pastoral concern. They are preparing for impact. They are talking about death. They are talking about conscience. They are talking about refusal. And they are doing it out loud, on the record, across multiple denominations, all at once. Picture this clearly. In the span of 48 hours, senior clergy in the United States moved from moral critique to moral readiness. Wills written, affairs ordered, souls prepared, not metaphorically, literally. An Episcopal bishop tells his clergy to be ready for martyrdom. A Catholic archbishop tells soldiers it would be morally acceptable to disobey a presidential order. And then, as if on cue, the three most powerful Catholic cardinals in the country issue a joint condemnation of American foreign policy and the moral direction of the state. This is not a coincidence. This is alignment. And alignment at this level never happens unless something fundamental has shifted. The shock is not that the clergy disagree with power. That has always happened. The shock is the escalation. The shock is the abandonment of caution. The shock is that institutions built on patience, hierarchy, and restraint are now speaking in the language of emergency. They are not debating policy details. They are not parsing intentions. They are framing the moment as one of moral danger so acute that ordinary obedience may no longer apply. One bishop tells NPR that he is not asking anyone to seek danger. He is asking them to live without fear of death. Have your will written. Have your soul ready. Be prepared in case you find yourself in trouble. This is not rhetoric designed for fundraising or sermons. This is battlefield language. It is language used when leaders believe confrontation is no longer theoretical. On the very same day, the Catholic Archbishop who serves the U.S. Armed Forces speaks to the BBC. He is asked about the possibility that the President of the United States may order the military to invade Greenland. His answer is precise, careful, and devastating. It would be difficult for a service member to disobey such an order, he says, but it would be morally acceptable to do so. Conscience would permit refusal. That sentence alone detonates centuries of assumptions about civilian control, military obedience, and moral clarity. Then comes the next day. The escalation continues. The cardinals of Washington, Chicago, and Newark, three of the most powerful clerics in American Catholic life, release a joint statement condemning what they call the moral role of the country in the world. They explicitly reject war as an instrument of narrow national interest. They warn that sovereignty and self-determination are becoming fragile. They renounce the normalization of military force. This is not abstract theology. This is a direct indictment of current policy. Watch what is happening here. Religious leaders are not reacting to one event. They are responding to a pattern: Greenland, Ukraine, Venezuela, immigration raids, mass deportations, militarization. They are drawing a straight line from domestic policy to foreign aggression, from executive power to moral collapse. This is the moment when institutions stop hedging. This is the moment when credibility is spent. Clergy do not invoke martyrdom lightly. Bishops do not tell soldiers that disobedience can be righteous unless they believe obedience itself has become suspect. The immediate stake is not theology, it is legitimate. When churches that represent tens of millions of Americans begin openly discussing conscience against the state, the social contract is under strain. Not in theory, in practice. And once that strain becomes visible, it does not reverse quietly. This is not noise. This is not symbolism. This is pressure being applied from a direction that does not bluff, and it has only just begun. Before going further, the ground rules matter. The church is not a political party. It does not run candidates. It does not issue executive orders. It operates in a space that is both inside and outside the state. That is precisely why this matters. When religious institutions speak this directly, it is not because they believe they can win a policy fight. It is because they believe the moral framework itself is being dismantled. The trust reset here is subtle but essential. These leaders are not claiming authority over government. They are asserting responsibility as citizens. They are grounding their critique in history, in post-World War II consensus, in the long-standing rejection of unilateral force and indiscriminate punishment. This is not radicalism. This is institutional memory speaking back to power. Legally, the implications are severe. Civilian control of the military is foundational. Orders are presumed lawful. Soldiers are trained to obey first, question later. But that presumption has limits. International law, military law, and moral law intersect at one point. Unlawful orders. Orders that violate treaties, sovereignty, or basic human rights are not protected simply because they come from above. When an archbishop responsible for the spiritual care of service members publicly states that refusal could be morally acceptable, he is invoking that intersection. He is reminding soldiers that conscience is not erased by uniform, that obedience is not absolute, that legality and morality are not automatically aligned with executive command. This is not abstract. An invasion of Greenland would implicate NATO alliances, international treaties, and the principle of territorial sovereignty. Service members would not simply be executing logistics. They would be participating in an act that reshapes global norms. The Church is signaling that such participation carries moral liability. The same framework applies domestically. Mass deportations conducted indiscriminately raise constitutional questions, due process concerns, and humanitarian law issues. When Cardinal Kupik speaks of families torn apart and communities terrorized, he is not using poetic language. He is describing state action that tests legal boundaries. The bishop's statements are careful to acknowledge the separation of church and state. And then they move past it. Separation does not mean silence. It means independence. And independence is exactly what gives these statements weight. They are not defending partisan interests. They are defending limits. Notice the repetition: sovereignty, conscience, last resort, human dignity. These words recur because they anchor legal principles. The renunciation of war as a normal instrument of policy is not a theological preference. It is a restatement of international norms designed to prevent catastrophe. What makes this moment dangerous for the administration is that the Church is not isolated. It is aligned across denominations. Episcopal leaders speak of martyrdom. Catholic leaders speak of refusal. Together, they are reframing obedience itself as a moral question. Once that framing takes hold, legal defenses weaken. Courts do not operate in a vacuum. Neither do soldiers, neither do citizens. Legitimacy depends on a shared belief that authority is exercised within bounds. The clergy are asserting that those bounds are being crossed. This is not a call to rebellion. It is something more destabilizing. It is a declaration that the moral consensus underpinning obedience is eroding. And once obedience becomes conditional, power becomes brittle. That brittleness is what comes next. The escalation is no longer rhetorical, it is institutional. Courts, churches, and communities are now operating on parallel tracks, and they are moving away from the administration, not toward it. Start with Chicago, Operation Midway Blitz. Federal agents flood immigrant neighborhoods, raids, detentions, fear. The stated image is enforcement. The lived reality is trauma. Cardinal Kupich responds not as a politician, but as a witness. Families torn apart, children afraid, communities shaken. These actions wound the soul of the city. That phrase matters. It reframes law enforcement as moral injury. The administration projects strength. The Church describes damage. That is the image-reality collapse. Power insists it is restoring order. Moral institutions insist that it is creating disorder. Once that split becomes visible, authority fractures. The escalation continues internationally. Greenland is not just a place, it is a test case. An attempted seizure would not be read as a strategic necessity. It would be read as adventurism. The cardinals say this explicitly. They reject war for narrow national interests. They warn against the easy turn to violence. They invoke the fragility of sovereignty in a world already on edge. Watch the pattern. Each time the administration asserts unilateral power, a moral counterweight appears. Each time force is normalized, restraint is invoked. This is not coordination in the conspiratorial sense. It is convergence. Different institutions responding to the same stressor. The humiliation phase begins quietly. It begins when authority is challenged not by rivals but by referees. Clergy are not competitors for power. They are arbiters of legitimacy. When they withdraw moral endorsement, power does not disappear, but it becomes exposed. The administration cannot easily attack this. Denouncing clergy risks alienating believers. Ignoring them allows the narrative to harden. Engaging them requires justification on moral grounds, not political ones. That is not terrain this administration prefers. Meanwhile, communities organize. Legal services expand. Mutual aid networks grow. Protest remains peaceful but persistent. The Church supports materially and symbolically. This is not defiance for spectacle. It is infrastructure being built for resistance within the law. The image of total control collapses under the weight of lived reality. Federal power looks strong on paper. On the ground, it looks contested. And contested power invites scrutiny. Judges notice, lawyers notice, international partners notice. When religious leaders from Rome to Chicago speak of alarm, it signals that America's internal checks are activating. Not because they want confrontation, but because they fear consequence. Humiliation implication here is not about embarrassment, it is about exposure. The exposure of overreach, the exposure of isolation, the exposure of a government increasingly at odds with institutions that once buffered its authority. This is how pressure builds, not with explosions, but with alignment. When moral language, legal standards, and public action begin to rhyme, power finds itself constrained from directions it cannot control, and the options narrow. At this stage, the administration faces choices. None of them is good. Option 1, double down, escalate enforcement, expand raids, assert military readiness, frame opposition as disloyal. This risks accelerating institutional backlash. Courts become more aggressive, clergy become more explicit, international allies grow wary, legitimacy erodes faster. Option 2, retreat quietly, scale back rhetoric, slow implementation, allow policies to stall without admission. This preserves some stability but concedes authority implicitly. Power that retreats without acknowledgement invites further challenge. Option 3, confrontation with moral institutions, attack bishops, question their patriotism, weaponize culture war narratives. This mobilizes a base, but fractures the broader coalition that sustains governance. It turns moral arbiters into adversaries. Option 4, legal justification, attempt to reframe action strictly within statutory language, argue technical compliance. This fails to address the core critique. The critique is not legality alone, it is legitimate. All paths lead to constraint. That is the defining feature of this moment. The rule of law is no longer a shield, it is a spotlight. The Church's framing forces every action to be evaluated not just for compliance, but for consequence. This is where the rule of law becomes unavoidable. Laws are not self-executing. They rely on belief, on shared acceptance that authority is exercised for the common good. The cardinals invoke this explicitly. They speak of responsibility for the nation and the world. They reject hesitation in offering moral guidance. Their message is disciplined. They do not threaten. They do not incite. They remind. They recall history. They point to the post-war consensus. They assert that multilateralism, dialogue, and restraint are not luxuries. They are safeguards. The administration's difficulty is that this argument is not fringe. It is mainstream. It echoes international law. It echoes constitutional values. It echoes the language taught in military ethics courses. That makes dismissal costly. Rule of law in this framing is not about obedience. It is about limits. And limits are being enforced socially, legally, and morally. Not by one institution, but by many. The more power insists on its right to act, the more these institutions insist on the duty to resist within the law. The tension does not resolve through force. It resolves through accountability. This is not a revolution. It is a reckoning. And reckonings are slow, methodical, and difficult to stop once underway. The fallout is already visible. International observers recalibrate. Allies listen to the cardinals' warnings and hear echoes of their own concerns. Domestically, faith communities feel permission to speak. Silence breaks. Statements multiply. Moral language becomes part of the political bloodstream. The administration remains in office. Power remains real. But it is no longer uncontested. Every action is weighed against a growing moral ledger. Every escalation invites a response, not from agitators, but from institutions designed to endure. This is the inevitable ending, not collapse. Constraint, not overthrow. Accountability. Power does not disappear. It narrows. It slows. It is forced to justify itself not only to voters but to history. The clergy did not choose this role. They were pushed into it. When policy crossed from debatable to dangerous, they responded with the tools they had: language, conscience, community. They spoke in terms of martyrdom, not to seek death but to signal seriousness. They spoke of refusal not to incite chaos but to preserve moral agency. Once that signal is sent, it cannot be unsent. Institutions remember, soldiers remember, citizens remember. The idea that obedience has limits takes hold. And that is how this ends. Not with a single decision, but with a shift. A shift in how power is perceived, a shift in what is tolerated, a shift in the boundaries of legitimacy. The administration may continue, policies may advance or stall, but the moral consensus has changed. And when consensus changes, outcomes follow, slowly, inevitably. This is not speculation, this is pattern recognition. History is clear on this point. When institutions built on patience decide they must speak urgently, it is because they believe the cost of silence has surpassed the cost of confrontation. We are past the warning phase. We are in the accountability phase now.